Hi, everyone. Welcome to this month's YA SFF debuts edition. You can tell that we're getting towards the end of the year because I'm losing any creativity for the names. It's just turning into month by month, whatever month it is for the panels. But I'm so excited for this panel today. If you didn't know who I am, my name is Lily. I'm the moderator. I'm kind of like the face behind Utopia State of Mind on the internet. So now we're going to have our lovely panelists talk to us about their books. Also, there will be a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, please drop them in the chat and I will remember to get to them. So we're going to start with Brittany.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany N. Williams. I am the author of That Selfsame Metal, a YA historical fantasy set in Shakespearean London. That Selfsame Metal follows 16-year-old Joan Sands. She has the magical ability to manipulate metal, but she only wants to use those powers to build swords and choreograph fights for William Shakespeare's acting company. But when malevolent fae invade London, she finds she's one of the few people who can protect the city. So that's the long and short of it. Boom. Elevator pitch.
Great. Okay, I'll go next. My name is Clara Kumagai, and this is my YA speculative fiction magical realism novel. It is set in Japan, and it's set 7 years after an earthquake so big that it broke time itself. So there's different places in Japan where time runs faster or slower than normal, and they call these the time zones. So they're too dangerous for people to live in. And the main character is Sora. She's Japanese Canadian. She lost her mother in this huge earthquake. Her father is a scientist who is studying these time zones, but as a result, he's becoming increasingly sick. Sora is one of those people who goes in to explore these time zones as well. And then part of her journey is trying to find a way to help her father. And at the same time, she's still searching for her mother, even though she lost her so many years ago. Yes, so it is inspired by a Japanese myth and also by the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake.
Hi, I'm Lauren Yarrow, and I am, the author of this book, Under This Forgetful Sky. It's young adult speculative fiction set in a near future world divided by walls. So the sort of elevator pitch is that two teens from vastly different worlds, there's a glare on here, but you can see them, from vastly different worlds, have to journey across the wilds of post-collapse Chile and search for a cure for a mysterious virus. One of them, Rumi, needs the cure to save his father's life, and he's in desperate need for this cure. And the other, Paz, she is working in secret for the very same rebels who infected Rumi's father in the first place. So it is a story where on paper they're enemies, but of course it turns out to be a whole lot more complicated than that.
Hi, I'm Lauren Thoman. This is Astrid. She's very nervous for some reason. I think we have a cold front moving in. She's scared of weather. So she might be assisting me today. This is my book I wrote, I'll Stop the World, which in this, the speculative twist actually takes us to the past. It's about a modern teenager named Justin who one day gets into a car accident, and instead of dying, which is the logical outcome, he instead wakes up in the year 1985, a week before the mysterious deaths of his grandparents, and he teams up with a teenager from 1985 named Rose, who's a biracial Chinese American girl, to solve and prevent their mysterious deaths a week before they happen. So, and mine's technically marketed as adult, but it's really a crossover. It's YA, it's adult. Basically, adult readers are like, isn't this YA? And then YA readers are like, there are adults in this. So it really just sits right on that line. But I just say for teens and up.
Hello, I'm Lena Jung. I'm the author of the book And Break the Pretty Kings, which is about a Korean crown princess who the night that she's supposed to ascend the throne, of course, everything goes wrong. Her brother gets kidnapped by an ancient evil, and she unlocks a new power of switching with herself in the future. So she goes to the future, her future self, and her future self goes to her past self, and together they're trying to figure out how to save her brother and their queendom from this ancient evil.
Yeah, this hearing about all the books again, it was funny when I was reading the panel or the books for this panel, all of them are very different. But then when I was making the actual questions that I'll talk about later, which will pair books together, I realized that there were so many themes, so many pieces that kind of each echo each other, and it was really hard to actually come up with a final list of questions. So I'm really intrigued to hear what everyone has to think. The first question that I have is kind of general world building. We talked about the speculative fiction and all of these magical historical events going on in all the books. So I wanted to know, how did you all approach creating your speculative worlds? And when you were envisioning the idea of the book, what did you want to explore first specifically? So, Elena, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. So at first, this book was a way for me to try to reconnect with my Korean heritage. So that was a big part of why I started even doing the research. And then I started getting ideas and wanted to tell stories. And so that's, kind of where this all began, was doing lots of research and trying to understand where I came from, which is, something that a lot of people can understand, especially with immigrant parents. And at first, what I wanted to explore was sibling relationships. So at its heart, it started out as a story about how relationships with your family, your siblings specifically, can change or bend or even deteriorate over time, and figuring out how to navigate all of that, which is hard to do when you're a teenager, as in a YA novel. But she's catching glimpses, of how things turn out in the future, and trying to figure out how or if you can prevent things by being, a less selfish human being, or if there are just some things you need to accept, letting your siblings go, letting them exist outside of you, and those sorts of things, where this story even began.
I'll jump in just because my speculative world is a little different in that it's the real world, but it's the real world of the past, and it's through. I grew up in the '80s. I watched so many '80s movies, but I never saw people like me reflected in them, or like anyone on this panel really, except as like the gimmicky, maybe supporting character, sidekick, comic relief, that sort of thing. You know, we were never the main characters in '80s fiction. So I was like, what if I did this '80s story that feels in some ways like very true to that period? I wanted to pull in all those little elements that evoke that, from the weird clothing to the VHS tapes and the rotary phones. And only having like whatever happened to be on the 4 channels that you got in the middle of the day. But I want to do it with a very diverse cast, and sort of see that lens of the people that existed, but we didn't have stories, that at least not mainstream stories, and then just sort of give those characters a pretty commercial, like high concept time travel murder mystery story that they were all gonna solve together, and that they were all going. And so my book takes it's an ensemble cast, and we have multiple points of view. And I kind of wanted to highlight that every person is the main character in their own story. They're all having these different experiences that they don't realize is all playing into this overarching narrative that is the main plot of my book, because they've all got their own main storylines. And so for me, it was first of all pulling in all of those pieces that everyone associates with the '80s. So we all had that nostalgia, but then blending it with what would the people who were not typically depicted, who were in more marginalized communities, having those different perspectives, how would their stories have been both the same and different from what we typically see depicted? And then also laying over it this time travel piece, which I think one of the biggest, most important things when you're world building with speculative, because like I've also written like fantasy and sci-fi. It's just this happens to be my debut. And I always think the most important thing is that you have to ground your speculative element, like put some parameters around it so that it feels real and anchor it in the real world for us. So, I mean, for me with the time travel, it was if you have characters time traveling who don't happen to be quantum theorists, or physicists or anything, like they're going to really freak out about that and they're going to have a lot of questions. And also like just trying to figure out, how does this work? What are the rules? What can I do? And trying to be really consistent, so that even though it's speculative, it feels real. It feels like a thing that could really happen.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump off of what Lauren T said, because I also wrote a book that is set in the real world, but in the past, specifically 1605 London, which none of us have experienced, I don't think, unless y'all have some secrets to share. And I also wanted to show the people who are often left out of history. We are, particularly when we're looking at Shakespeare and the past in the West, where like it was this beautiful all white world where there were just no other people of color. Everybody was straight. It was just this very incorrect version of history. So when I wrote this book, I wanted to assert through fiction that Black people existed in London in this time. Non-white people existed in London in this time. Like it's always been this like multicultural metropolitan city. And that queer people weren't invented in the 80s. We've always been around. And to really dig into my love of Shakespeare, I've loved Shakespeare since I was in elementary school. And as a Black woman, both performer and person who's like interested on a scholarly level, anytime I tried to engage, I was treated as an outsider and as someone who they just kind of let in. Like you can come in, but remember, you're always a guest. And as soon as we want to kick you out, we can kick you out. So this series is my kind of pushback against that, and just to have it so that any other like a 16 the current 16-year-old version of like person who's similar to me can have this to use as ammunition when people try to tell her the same bullshit. Sorry, but bullshit. So.
I'll jump in next. So, Lena, I have a somewhat similar kind of access into this story. So my family is Cuban American, but Cuba, it turns out, is a really complicated place, and it's not an easy kind of place to reconnect with for a lot of reasons. And so my reconnection in my 20s was kind of more generally to my Latina identity and kind of learning to speak Spanish because we didn't speak Spanish at home. And so I was traveling and living and working all over the Spanish-speaking world, and was working as a travel writer in Chile when this story came to me. And so I was based in the city of Valparaiso, which is one of my favorite places in the world now. But when I came back from that time abroad, I had this sort of idea for a story where this city was transformed in some way, and it was this place that was suddenly infused with danger in a way that felt really interesting to me, and I wanted to kind of investigate what happened there. And so the questions that I had kind of come back from my time abroad with, these questions about what we owe to each other in our like intricately interconnected world, were infused into that investigation of like, okay, how did this city that I knew and loved come to be different in this way. And I realized, okay, so this city doesn't exist in isolation. It exists because other forces are making it this way. What are those other forces? What does that look like? Okay, what if there are these other cities and these walled-in cities that pretend that the outside world doesn't exist and that they're not connected to it in any way and they have no responsibility for it? Okay, what does it look like to be born into that city? And what does it look like to be born outside of those cities? What does it look like to be coming of age? And so it kind of like grew from there. And so it went from this kind of in like this reconnection with my own personal heritage in a way, in a roundabout way, that then led to this place, that then led to these questions of character, and then story sort of grew out of that. Um, so
Yeah, so then I think in the world of my book, a lot of it was sort of inspired by also by things that were like really happened and by the real world. And of course, a big theme in the book is time and time being broken. And one of the things that inspired that was learning that the earthquake in 2011 in Japan was so big that it shifted our Earth on its axis. So our planet spins faster as a result, and our year is shorter by, I think it's like 1.8 microseconds. It's really a very small amount of time, but this earthquake physically changed time, right, for everybody on the planet. And that's not the first time that's happened. It's happened with other earthquakes or other kinds of really big natural disasters. But that was one way I began to think of time as something tangible and something that's tied to place. And then that continued into the time zones in the book. And there's some areas around the TEPCO nuclear plant. So this is one of the effects of the earthquake and tsunami, was the nuclear meltdown in the TEPCO plant in Fukushima prefecture. And there's still a lot of places around there that had to be evacuated. And when I visited those places, it was also a way of seeing time, because there's some things where it's like someone left yesterday, right? Like someone's clothes are still hanging up, ready to be worn. And then in other ways, it's like time has accelerated and you see like nature really taking over. And that's kind of, it's very uncanny. For me, the element of like the natural world taking over also has a sense of beauty to it. But that was also where I could really see, time being experienced, or, I could visualize time differently. And I think both of those things really feel like science fiction, like when I learned about it or when I visited those places, but they, they actually are real. So it wasn't so hard for me to like develop that speculative aspect in the book. And of course, there is Japanese myth and legend, which, it was not so hard for me to work into this world because we had the elements of time in it. And then I think by doing that, I was able to explore themes of like memory and loss and trauma as well. And I guess this is the thing with anything speculative. It's like, by creating a world in which that happens, you can look at these themes or these ideas in a way that characters can really interact with them. That it's not just like an abstract idea or like a philosophical conversation. So my character can visit those places, as well as like reliving memory or trying to work through trauma as well.
Moving on to the next kind of topic as well for the panel, which is being a debut author. I would love to know, as debuts, what do you think was an expectation that you had about your experience but proved untrue? Because I feel like a lot of times everyone can have a lot of expectations about what could happen, but then I want to know what you thought was going to happen, but maybe didn't happen, or was it untrue? Lauren, why? Do you want to start?
sure. So I remember before, having a book that I was querying, this idea of writing the book is the easy part. And I was, had just gotten done with writing and revising and rewriting and re-revising, and I'm like, that cannot be possible. But and it's not to say that writing a book is easy, but writing a book as an author, you have the tools for that. You've been honing your craft, and so it's something that you are able. It's a challenge that you're able to kind of, meet. And the post publication skill set of trying to get your book out there and is something that has been surprising to me, of how involved authors are in that part of the process. And so what has been an absolute surprise and delight is just how supportive authors have been of each other, and these kinds of events that we get to do together to promote each other and sort of lift each other up. So that's been both a challenge and a wonderful surprise.
First, I will say, when you were like, Lauren, why? I forgot we were using last initials, and I was like, oh, I don't know why. And then I was like, oh, right, not me. So it's interesting for me because this is not the first book I tried to sell. I actually, like, I've had my agent for years, and we tried to sell numerous books before this one. So when you've been trying to sell a book for a long time, and you've been at that agented stage, I know a lot of published authors. So I thought I was very well prepared for what publishing a book looked like, because so many of my friends had already gone through that journey. And so I knew, I was like, oh, authors are regular people, and here are all the things to expect. So I think the biggest surprise for me was how much I did not actually know. Like, that there's so much on the other side of this that you really do have to experience. And even though I had so many very close friends that I had talked to in detail about what their experience was like, there are just like, there are business aspects that just do not come up in regular conversation. There's terminology that, like, it's not necessarily like the fun stuff that you share with your friends. And so my agent would email me and be like, so here's like this and this is happening. I'd be like, all right, sounds great. Also, what are those things? I don't know what that is. And there were other parts that just, it really is so unique from person to person. And just because I knew someone else who had and also it's changed so much over time. So I'd have friends that say, well, this worked for me, when I debuted in 2017 or whatever. And that now I'm like, well, that's not even a thing anymore. Like, and so just how much you have to like kind of learn on the fly. And then also, while, yeah, as Lauren Y said, just like balancing all these things, and um just trying to sort of figure it out as you go. I thought I wouldn't have to figure it out as I go, because I thought, I was like, I have done my research, and it turns out I only had been able to research this small fraction of what it's actually like.
So for me, I had this like combo hope and fear. And in the way that hopes and fears are like reflections of each other. I was afraid that no one would show up to any of my events, that I would go to the few places that I was going, and it would just be like me and the booksellers, like, hey guys, what's up? And then I had this hope that like, oh, well, what if I'm one of those, one of those strikes of lightning, and then it's like 8 billion people are suddenly huge fans of my book. Where it landed was somewhere in the middle. I'm very grateful. I am very happy about like the way reality turned out. And I don't think I was equipped to handle what I hoped for, because I don't know how I would handle a sudden influx of like so many people wanting to know so much about my life. But it's just been really, I was hoping to meet new readers and meet people who were fans of the book. The beautiful reality of actually getting to talk to people who love this story that I wrote with all my heart has just been so touching. And it's, you can prepare for that mentally all you want. You can kind of think through like, oh, this is how I'm going to respond to people. But until you actually are in front of someone who has who dove so deeply into these words that you put on the page, and who was touched by the words that sometimes it felt like you were drawing from your very soul like with like with all of the strength within you, is just so wonderful. So I really it yeah, that was something that I wasn't ready for, with the debut whole year and world.
Yeah, I think this is probably maybe like the hope and fear I had was similar. Like for lots of events, it felt like organizing, your own birthday party, where as you plan it, you're like, this is going to be great. And then as you get closer, it's like, why did I do this to myself? Like I feel very stressed about it. But luckily, I've had a really good time with, doing events and meeting people. But as Lauren Y was saying, I kind of now feel like the book part was easier in some ways because it's like self-directed and you have time to work things out, and you feel like pretty accomplished when it's done. So I also, I think, wasn't really expecting that, like, now this is the next stage of the book, even though it's finished, it's out in the world, but the next stage now is talking about it and going places and meeting people, and now it feels like the book is living in a different way. So I think that's been actually really fun to do. As people give me like feedback or ask questions, it's like I am thinking about the book differently or thinking about different aspects of it differently. It's been really amazing, and this was a hope as well, to meet people who related to the character, if they're multiracial or if they grew up feeling like the place or culture that they grew up in didn't feel exactly theirs, or they had to work it out. And that's been really important to me, and sometimes very moving actually to hear that. So those have all been really great things. And I think, in terms of things that are humbling, I suppose, is just going into a bookshop and saying, "Do you have my book?" And they say, "What book?" No. And also, I think this is good to happen every now and then. Going into a bookshop, and booksellers, by the way, amazing. I've loved connecting with booksellers. So passionate, especially for children's and YA. Like, gosh, they're great. But I did go into a bookshop and say, "Would you like me to sign the books, the copies that you have?" And the bookseller said, "Well, if you sign them, I don't think I can return them." And I said, "Oh, okay." Okay. And then she said, "Oh, the hardbacks actually I can't return anyway, so you can sign those." And there was a paperback, and she said, "Don't sign that one. I can return it." So I was like, okay, it's a business, and actually I do think that's something that you're reminded of in the process. Publishing is a business, and that feels very different from the creative aspect of it. Um, and that is something I think you learn pretty fast. Yeah.
My answer to this question is more of a self burn, where I thought I had this weird expectation that, if you get your book published and that you'll become buddies with all these amazing authors. I thought I would make friends. So a bit of a self burn, but as it turns out, you still have to put in the work to make friends. I guess I thought there would be like a secret Facebook group or something, or it's like, you got a book published, we'll add you and you can make friends here. So that didn't turn out to be true, unless there is one and I just wasn't added. If there was, add me.
So I want to segue a little bit into the questions that pair books together. As I've said before, I had a lot of them. These were just the final draft. So first of all, I want to start with "I'll Stop the World and Break the Pretty Kings," because I think you both play with concepts of time jumping, and specifically also the influence that you can have on time and how that influences your fate. Those are like huge themes in both of your books. So I want to know, when you were first envisioning your book, did it always have that element? And how did you approach that from a drafting perspective? Because I think that your characters all have like special perspectives, I guess, on how malleable time can be. So I'd love to know um, about like their journey, I guess, or relation to that concept. Lauren T, do you want to start?
Sure. So for me, the whole idea of, you know, how much influence do we have on things? How much do our choices matter? And like, how control are we over our own lives? Like, the idea of like fate versus randomness. That's all really interesting. And um, and I knew I really wanted to play with that sort of universal idea of how much what we do matters. Um, which is one of the reasons I have a multi-point of view cast, especially Justin and Rose, my two main characters, because they have completely opposite ideas about those things. Justin thinks that everything is sort of chance and random and pointless, and Rose is determined that there has to be purpose, like there has to be like this sort of um this sense of mattering, of things have to be important. And so she's the one who's like, well, this big event happened, maybe if we change it, that's why you're here, it's for a purpose. And he's like, or the universe just like sneezed and now I'm here. um and so but I also really wanted to explore, like, Justin, there's a reason that I picked like a cisgendered straight white boy to be my time traveler, because I was like, I really knew that he was the one that could sort of go into another time period and have this privilege of just sort of being able to be there and be like, all right, what's happening here? And that he could prioritize the time travel part of it and not the, oh, how do I survive now in this different time? Because it's going to be harder for literally any other identity, the further back you go in history. That to take someone with that level of privilege and put them in a time that wasn't so long ago and have him sort of observe through this like Gen Z eyes of um what's changed, what different, what haven't I noticed before that I really should notice. And in those ways sort of realizing that his own actions do matter, even outside of that grand scheme of things, of seeing just sort of seeing the world in a different way than he ever has before. So I liked the idea of playing with all those different parts of time, but also then as far as how I drafted it, it was difficult, because I had all these different characters that I wanted to weave in these different perspectives and all of have them engage in the same story without realizing it. So I mean, for me, it turned into a lot of spreadsheets. I had a lot of spreadsheets. There were a lot of color coding things that happened, dates, and just trying to keep it all straight and make sure that I was remembering that like some days had like 25 days in them and then other weeks had like 2, and that's not how time works. So logistically it was challenging, but that whole messiness of not really knowing, not having that certainty of, if I change this, what's going to happen, and just sort of having to take those like leaps of faith of like, will it matter at all or will it matter too much? Like, what do I do? Because I think even though we're not, as far as I know, any of us time travelers, um, we do all sort of have that degree of like, what choice is the right choice and how much will it affect things down the line? And this just sort of by sending him backwards so that he knew that his own future is sort of at stake there. I felt like it gave a bigger sense of urgency, but in this more universal question.
And Lauren's book is brilliant. So I think it's really cool how we both wrestled with some of those things of the idea of fate and destiny, and what choices matter. Do they matter? And if they don't matter, then who's pulling the strings? Can we trust them? In my book, like kind of wrestling with some of those questions as well. And this is a series, so you're not going to get those questions answered in the first book, sorry. So keep reading. But when I started and Break the Pretty Kings, it always had that element of the switching with herself in the future and the future going to the past. That was kind of actually the concept behind starting this story. So that was always a part of it. But at first, I wrote it to be a little bit more whimsical, where there's just this girl who's slipping in and out of time and just catching glimpses and feeling heartbreak over things that are happening in the future that she can't stop, and also feeling joy over the things that she has to look forward to. So it was a bit more, I guess, if to me it felt more Miyazaki than the story it ended up turning into. Because as I was trying to write a tighter story, especially to make it more marketable, more sellable, I I started feeling like I needed to pinpoint exact questions like destiny and fate and who's pulling the strings. Can we change things? Can we not change things? What does that mean if we can? What does it mean if we can't? And so by pinpointing what questions I wanted to explore with the switching and the time traveling, that's how we ended up with the story that we have. So it started out tonally very different.
Yeah, that's why I loved pairing the both of your books together, because on the surface they seem very, very different, and then there is this core, like, almost universal kind of relatable question about our own influence and time. Um, Next, I want to talk about That Self-Same Metal and Under This Forgetful Sky. Both of your books have rebellion, and they explore politics, divided factions. And I would love to know how you both created these forces and powers within your world, and if you could talk about specifically in relation to that, the creation and development of side characters within that sort of a larger, big meaty kind of question. Brittany, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. So, in this book, I have this huge conflict between the Fey world and the mortal world. And one thing that was fundamentally important for me was to not do the thing that so many fantasy writers do, where it's like, oh, well, the enemy, everybody's bad. If you're a Fey, you're bad. And you're always monstrous and this. And if you're, mortal, that means you're good. I wanted to show that the good people and the bad people on both sides of this conflict. And as the series goes on, you'll see that the whole separation and this this kind of war that Joan is being drawn into, things aren't as cut and dry as all wars tend to be. And when it came to side characters, I had a lot of fun writing. So the entire series has these interludes that happen, and they are separate mostly from the main story. And they kind of let us see the conflict and what's going on through the eyes of someone else, like someone else throughout London. And it was it was so much fun. It is so much fun writing those, because otherwise the story is told very closely through Joan's point of view. She's the daughter of a goldsmith who works at the theater, so she has a very narrow understanding of what is happening throughout the city. So it's been really fun to flesh out the world that way, and to give people other aspects of Jacobean London at the time. And I specifically wanted to insert as many queer characters as I could and then not kill them. So yeah, that's the.
So yeah, I love those moments in your book, Brittany. Those are so much fun, and I think it's so neat that our books are being paired together today. So there are these, like I talked about earlier in my book, there are the two big factions, like the upper city and the lower city. But within that, it gets much more granular and complex, because when you have systems of power like that, you're also going to have people that are interested in preserving those systems and people that are interested in dismantling those systems. And those different roles are not entirely, like you were saying, Brittany, they're not entirely good or bad. Like, it's often very morally gray. And so I had it was really interesting for me in, like, kind of building out the complexity of this near future world, to have like, for instance, there's this rebel faction. They are known as Las Oscuras, and they are willing to use any means necessary to take down Upper City. And there are a lot of people in Lower City who sympathize with that, but there are also a lot of people that fear them. And so in creating that kind of faction, like, as a reader, you can at the same time agree with certain things that they're saying and agree with certain things that they're doing, but also, like, you can see it as not black and white. And at this, there's also this kind of group of elders that are known as collectively as the library, and they are interested in preserving these systems of power. They're also in outside of the walls of Upper City, but they are for their own purposes, interested in preserving the way that power is structured in this world. And so kind of seeing, yeah, just all of the different ways that people choose to engage with these systems of power, and seeing then these two protagonists who are actually have very little power other than to make decisions in their own lives. And so to kind of navigate the world primarily through those perspectives of, like, if there are all of these different factions, and they are all so much more powerful than you and so much bigger than you and have been around for so much longer than you, how do you choose to live once you kind of see a bigger picture of the world and your place in it? And so that's kind of what I was exploring there with the different factions. And to be honest, like, it's not very hard to see correlations between this book and a lot of stuff that is going on in the world. But like you were saying, Clara, earlier, speculative fiction has this kind of unique power. It lets a reader who might have certain entrenched ideas or biases about things that are happening in the real world, it kind of opens your mind up to being more to other perspectives and other ideas that might feel closed off to you in your day-to-day existence. And so being able to explore those things and having your mind open to perspectives that might seem um, at odds with what you believe, and having to wonder about them and having to think like, well, what do I actually think about this? I think that is something that speculative fiction is really unique in being able to do.
Yeah, and I love how you pointed out, like, you both are talking about larger power systems, but also the power of an individual is not obviously always the same as like the power that they are trying to confront. Um, so for Clara and Catfish Rolling, one of the things I really loved, despite how kind of like timey-wimey it is that you use kind of these liminal spaces of time pockets to also serve as a lens for Sora's biracial identity and like a whole host of other things that I was thinking about when I was making a list of like all of these metaphors, that are related to time and these pockets of space. So I would love if you could talk about how you explored these spaces of memory, identity, with time as a framework or a perspective, like to look into those themes.
Yeah, so I guess I've always been drawn to that kind of like the liminal space, or those spaces like in between. And I do think that at least partly comes from, growing up, being biracial or multiracial, because so my father's Japanese and my mother's Irish. And I think something that's like pretty common for people to face is like, where are you from? Or often like, oh, do you feel more Japanese? Do you feel more Irish? Like, which place do you prefer? These kinds of things that pose identity very much as a binary system, which even if you aren't, even if you aren't multiracial or biracial, you still need to work out your identity and how you relate to the world. But I do think it's, it feels starker, right? Because it's not just you internally thinking about these things; those questions are being directed at you a lot. And you can answer, and those answers are questioned again, right? Oh, why do you feel that way? What about this? So yeah, that kind of feeling is one I'm familiar with. And I think that's why the spaces in the book, again, were an interesting physical setting for that. And Sora really feels, sort of weirdly at home in these places. And often, she is alone, right? But at least she feels like she has freedom to explore, or to be brave, or to, sometimes bring others there. And I think like something else that's pointed out in the book is she's quite good at finding these places where time has broken or cracked, because of course they're invisible, right? Until time passes and you can see, differences. And one of her ideas for why that is because she's used to like seeing or knowing when one thing becomes another, and like treading that path in between. And something that I think is really important, like for me in my life, and then like a theme in the book is that you don't have to choose one of those things. You can have an identity that encompasses all those, that you can, contain multitudes, and that's fine. You don't have to give people easy answers. Like you don't owe that to people. Sometimes I'm happy to talk about it. I'm always super interested to talk about it with people who might have had different or similar identities or experiences with me, as me. But yeah, I think as I grew older, I became, I don't know, like less patient maybe, or less, I don't want to say less kind, but less likely to have to feel like I had to answer those questions. And if people are like, "Where are you from?" Sometimes I just say Ireland, and then they say, "Oh, you don't look Irish." And I think, a good answer for that is like, "Have you been to Ireland lately?" Like when was the last time you were in Galway? Because now I feel like I'm not as, isolated in many ways as I was when I was growing up in like the early 90s. So yeah, and I think a lot of identity is rooted to place anyway, right? And how we relate to it, or how we're displaced from it, or move to it, or make it our own. And then I know you mentioned as well, like memory as well, and I think memory can feel like a physical place as well. And for something like trauma, I think something that people often explain it as, or describe it as being stuck in a loop, right? Being unable to break out of a cycle, or find it very difficult to move past something. And that's really difficult to do. So again, I think for Soda, one of those things was, how do you move forward, past, I was gonna say past the past, you know what I mean? Right? How do we move forward with those things? You don't have to forget them, you can accept them, and you can bring them into yourself as well.
Yeah, I feel like as I was reading your book, and specifically memory, I had recently had like a family member who had dementia, and I felt like so many pieces of the book and like what Sora's family and what Sora's dad's going through were like very spot on in the ways that you kind of become trapped by time in a sense. So that's why I wanted to ask that. Um, we're gonna go to audience questions, and the first one, oh, so if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. The first one that I'm going to take from the chat is one that I'd love to ask, which is basically, how did you come up with the title of your novel? And was it, a working title? Did it have to change the title story? So Lena, do you want to start?
Sure. My title actually came, I wish I could remember what work it was, but my book was in part inspired by like Arthurian legends, very, very minor inspiration, but it is there. And as I was looking through various I want to call them ancient, I guess they're not that ancient, but old works that feature Arthurian legends and lore and whatnot. There was just this line that was similar to my title, and it just really stood out to me. I don't remember where I found it. It was years ago. But that's what helped me come up with my title. I saw it and I was like, this seems epic, and also like it fits this idea of breaking the patriarchy, which I have going on a bit with my matriarchy. So yeah, that was the inspiration behind it. I wish I could remember specifics.
So I can go next. So my title was actually originally different, and it was originally an allusion to a Chilean folk song called Volver a los 17, which means returning to being 17, and by a Chilean folklorist named Violeta Parra. And I actually refer to that song in the novel, but the folks at Simon and Schuster did not think that we should use that in the title. And so just for copyright reasons. And so the original title was The Vines in the Wall. And which I really love, but I also love the new title. And so the new title, I actually just kind of like created just a document that had all of these different concepts and ideas and words, and I was just like, what are some of the big themes of the novel, but also the symbols and the images, and kind of just like threw a bunch of things together. And Under This Forgetful Sky, it refers both to this kind of in-book myth of the city of the sky and the city of the sea, that are at war and at odds with one another and have this very tumultuous relationship. Um, and so that's where sky comes from. And this idea of forgetfulness is this sense of who is able to have the luxury of forgetting and who is required to remember, because they can't forget, because it's embedded within their existence and their whole life. And so I like this idea of the novel is actually taking place under this sky that is able to forget, but it's, not everyone is able to forget. So that's kind of where the title came from.
I'm terrible at titles, and I tend to the title's the very last thing that I do. And so I had finished this book with the manuscript still just called The Time Travel Book, and that wasn't helpful. And I was like, if I'm going to give this to my agent, I need a title. So I was literally scrolling Twitter, RIP Twitter, and saw a tweet from Eric Smith, who's an agent and an author, about retitling his book, and he had used song lyrics to retitle his book. And I was like, "Ooh, song lyrics might be good," because then I started pulling up. I was like, "What would have been playing on the radio back in 1985 when my book takes place?" Because I was like, that might evoke an instant like sense of the feel of the book. And so I started literally just going through like Billboard lists of what was playing back then, what would have been, and so the song "I'm Not With You" by Modern English came out in '83, but as anyone who lived during the time of radio, it's like it plays for, it was still a chart topper for a few years after that. Um, and I was, I was just looking through and I was like, do any of these songs jump out at me as that have lyrics that could work for this book? And I was like, oh, that one might work. And I was reading through the lyrics, and then I was like thinking about the different interpretations of the lyrics, because there's this like love song interpretation, then also this like apocalyptic interpretation of the lyrics to this song. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, this really, really well encompasses not just the themes of the book of like this feeling of like stopping the world, time rolling backwards, sort of. I was envisioning that scene in Superman where he flies backwards around the earth enough times that it starts rotating the other way and that reverses time, which, very physically grounded. And like, but that he has to actually stop the earth and turn it back in order to fix this thing that's gone wrong. And also I thought it represented the two worldviews of my characters very well. Having the one that's got this sunny, happy outlook, and the other one's like, nope, we're all doomed. And then I even realized that the band had re-recorded the song during lockdown in 2020 and put it up on YouTube, recorded from their houses, as one of those things they were trying to do to entertain us when we all couldn't leave our houses. And so that's the version that my modern character Justin knows, because he watched all the COVID lockdown performances, because what else was anyone doing? And whereas Rose in the 80s has heard it on the radio and she heard it in movies. And so they've come to it from they've brought these two very different versions of it in their heads. And so I really liked the way it sort of felt like it encompassed the novel and the characters and so much that I then like retrofitted a scene where they're talking about the two meanings of the song into the book. And now people, they're like, am I meant to get the song stuck in my head immediately? I'm like, yes, you are. You're welcome.
I'm also horrible at titles, so I don't really have any good story for this. It was just a line somewhere in the book, and I don't know, it had a nice mouthfeel or something. And that was just one that stuck. I unfortunately I have nothing deeper than this. At one stage there was a comma and it was catfish comma rolling, and then I kept saying it out loud trying to work it out. We took the comma away, but I had no other ideas. This was this was it. And I just finished, a draft of my second novel, and I sent it to my agent and some other readers to read. And one of my notes was, could you please give me any suggestions for a title? I can't think of anything. And actually, I was like, one of the inspirations for the second novel was the opera Madame Butterfly, and like other older, a very old 12th century Japanese epic. So, I had a lot of material. I was like, I can definitely take a line from something there. And no, I I don't want to read the libretto of Madame Butterfly again for many reasons. But I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do with this one. Just praying someone gives me a good suggestion. I just find it very hard to distill something into a title, and something that's memorable and catchy but feels right for the whole book. Yeah, after writing like 90,000 words, I'm like, I don't know how I can. It's like those 2 words for the title or 5 words for the title turn out to be like the hardest ones. So yeah, it's one of the hardest parts of writing for me is the title.
So my title came to me while I was still drafting the first book, and it's a fraction of a quote from Shakespeare's King Lear from Act One, Scene One. Once the king tells his 3 daughters that they have to explain to him how much they love him, and whoever impresses him the most gets the largest tract of land. The eldest sister speaks, and then the middle sister, Regan, she speaks after, and she says, I am made of that self same metal as my sister, and judge me at her worth. So that self same metal really stuck out to me. The double meaning of metal being like the element, and also as like your will, your force, the kind of the power you have over the world around you. That really stuck with me about like the journey Joan goes on in book 1, as she's kind of discovering that these powers that she's only used to serve herself and for like fun things, can really be employed to like save her world and save everyone she loves. So that and also it's Shakespeare obsessed. Why not throw some more like Shakespeare bits in there? There are some chapter titles in book 1 that are also partial Shakespeare quotes. I really leaned into that in books 2 and 3, so they're all partial Shakespeare quotes. And book 2 is called Saint Seducing Gold, which is a portion of a quote from Romeo and Juliet. And with that one, Joan ends up at the royal court. And so I wanted to play around with this idea of what having access to that newfound bit of social power can do to a person who is other, like how it can change a person, or really how it can reveal who they are underneath that. So yeah, I love titles. I love titling stuff. If y'all need somebody to help you brainstorm titles, just hit me up. I'm like, I can go.
And the last question I want to kind of end or wrap up the panel with is by chatting a little bit about what you've been listening to, reading, playing, just like what you do and have been enjoying that is not like reading, not reading, sorry, is not writing oriented. Lauren T, do you want to start? Oh, you're muted.
I clicked, but I clicked the wrong place. I'm literally opening up my Libro app, and I'm like, what have I been listening to? Oh, I just finished because I'm currently actually listening to a friend's manuscript that is for an upcoming book. But the last one I finished before that was The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, which is just a delightful, cozy fantasy, like with just it's like a warm hug of a book. I just loved it so much. And then I am currently devouring The Other Black Girl on Hulu, um, which is sort of, about sort of microaggressions in publishing, but also it's like a thriller, and I have no idea what's going to happen. I'm so into it, and I normally have several different shows going at once. So we're also going through. I watch with my husband. We're going through the Fall of the House of Usher. Um, I I really like watching and reading things across a whole different variety of genres. Um, I have next up after I finish the book I'm reading, I have Patrick Stewart's memoir locked and loaded, ready to go on audio. He could read me the phone book. It's whatever, but like I love Star Trek so much. So, yeah, but I always try to balance out fiction, nonfiction, different genres in television. So I'm pretty happy with my choices lately.
So I'm in the middle of, or I'm towards the end of drafting book 3, which has taken all of like my mental focus, and I haven't been able to read anything except craft books. So Craft in the Real World, and this other book called 5,000 Words an Hour, which is like, I will never write that, but it's helped me be more productive. Listening to, I am still quite obsessed with Beyonce's Renaissance album. And so that has been driving me through the draft because it's just so motivating to me, and it's great. And I know it so well now, I can tune in and out as I'm writing, and it doesn't like drive me in a specific way. And then watching, I have been re-watching Pokemon with my toddler, which is incredible to do. Because it was such a huge part of like my childhood, and now to be sharing this with like my little boy and have him be excited about it, and thinking about him playing the game in the future, and maybe like us playing the game together, getting excited for finishing this book so I can pick the game back up myself is great. And also whenever I'm in a pinch, I'll pull up again, Beyonce obsessed, Beyonce's Homecoming documentary, and so I'll play that on one screen while I'm writing on the other. And it's just like hearing her talk about all of the struggles she went through trying to put that show up, having gone through a really harrowing pregnancy and working her way back from that, and seeing this amazing piece of art that she was able to put out to the world, even going through all that she went through, is just very motivating to me, as a newish mom who's also trying to like work and exist in a world that doesn't necessarily make things easy for moms. So
I also have I have two little kids. And so I've been listening to a lot of Moana soundtrack, dancing around the house to Moana, and uh, and watching a lot of Blueies. um, but reading, so I recently did a talk that was specifically focused on this subgenre of speculative fiction called cli-fi, which is like climate related fiction, and it spans more realistic stuff to much more speculative stuff to even like fantasy. And so I was doing a presentation that was kind of about the state of the field of that specific subgenre. So I've been reading like really deeply into that subgenre, and some of the books that I've really loved that I've read recently are Once There Were Wolves, which is a beautiful, very almost present day novel set in the Highlands of Scotland about the reintroduction of wolves into that ecosystem. But it's also there's kind of a gothic element. It's got some mystery in it. It's beautiful. The Light Pirate, which is set in Florida, where I'm from, is it spans this one person's entire life from the day that they're born in this like devastating hurricane in South Florida to this future Florida that looks very different it's a very climate altered Florida that looks very different from what we know now, but it's also like this heartbreaking, gorgeous novel. And then I've got Future Home of the Living God on my next up to read by Louise Erdrich. So that's kind of, yeah, I've got some very like more dense stuff in my reading, and then my listening and watching is a little bit more light fare.
Yeah, for me, I have been watching Crash Landing on You. I haven't really watched any K-drama before, and I'm really into it. And I love, you know, talking about stories and, you know, analyzing them and writing them. But I have to say with TV, I never know what's going to happen. I can't predict anything. My partner he's a video editor and he watches a lot of TV. So he always knows. He was like, of course they were going to break up in this episode, or you knew like that was going to happen. And I'm always like, seem to be going so well. You know, it's episode 4 of whatever. Of course, it's not going to end, but I'm always gasping. So I think with Crash Landing on You and the K-drama, there's lots of opportunities for gasps, you know, stuff I could never have seen coming. I'm listening to Mitski's new album, and I am reading, I've been reading a lot of contemporary, contemporary, I mean newly published, right? Published this year YA. I don't often like simultaneously read stuff, but I've been reading These Feathered Flames by Alexandra Overy and A Prayer for Vengeance by Leanne Schwartz. But I do like to almost like have a brain refresher if I've been reading a lot of things in like a similar genre. So it's kind of been for research for the second book. I've been reading The Tale of the Heike, which is the 12th century Japanese epic. And I feel like for me anyway, it's good to engage like different parts of my brain. That's what it feels like anyway, if I'm reading very different things. So often if I'm reading like even a lot of fiction, I'll try and read nonfiction. If I'm reading long books, I'll try and read a novella or short stories. If I'm reading a lot of things that are newly published, I'll try and go back and read an old classic. And that for me works really well. Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought up K-dramas because that was going to be my answer. I especially love the speculative ones, and just seeing all the different types of Korean storytelling that exist right now. I find it really inspiring. So that's kind of what I've been watching. Next up, I want to watch the show Moving, which I've heard so many really good things about. So that's up next for me. As far as reading, I've actually been reading the books by these lovely ladies. And I'm really, really enjoying it. They're so, so good. And Brittany, I need the next book. So whenever that's ready, that cliffhanger, like I need more.
Marks are out. I'm gonna get you one. I'll get you one.
Excellent, thank you. I'm so excited. But yeah, so that's what I've been reading. I'm such an unfocused reader, so to have like a list presented to me with a soft deadline, because I was like, I'm going to try to read them before the panel. So that I was like, this is so exciting to be able to have a little bit of direction here. So, and it's been so fun. I've really, really enjoyed all these books.
So that is the perfect segue to what I was going to say, which was obviously that I've left the links for everyone's books down in the description box below. So please make sure that you do all the amazing things, pick them up, request them, read them, review them, all of those different things. For all of these lovely panelists, I just want to thank everyone for watching. Thank you to everyone for sharing your words and worlds with us. And I hope everyone has a really great rest of your day. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much for your questions as well.
Yes, thank you.